All right, next we have Kevin Wessels. He's Director of Stewardship for the H.E. Butt Foundation, where he oversees land and water management along the headwaters of the East Frio River. He's also pursuing a master's degree in Fisheries and Wildlife Administration. There you go. Pointer's on the bottom of that. Underneath there, right there. There you go.
Thank you. Imagine you are tasked with managing 500 acres of juniper oak woodlands that have a diversity of topography with grasslands on the tops of the hills and mixed hardwood bottoms with intermittent draws and a small perennial creek. You're ready to start implementing management, but where do you begin? What do you do? How do you weigh the decisions to be made? And how do you know which factors should be considered to appropriately manage this land? Perhaps some of you have been faced with a similar scenario of attempting to weigh all of the possible influences. Now picture the outcome of all the possible decisions, and in 50 or 100 years, does the land have more or less integrity, stability, and beauty? My name is Kevin Wessels, and I'm here to tell you about some of the lessons that I'm actively learning from the land, the wildlife, and the water in the South Central Edwards Plateau. Now, before I begin, I want to say that many of the lessons are at this point purely anecdotal, and I'm not actively conducting scientific research on this to definitively claim anything. I need to pull out my notes here because some of these slides are too long. I also wanted to say that I certainly have confirmation bias. I want my hands-on management to make the land better. And perhaps I'm not seeing the results as you might see them. So please take what I say cautiously, as it might not be correct. I'm on a continuum of learning from the land and from others. Also, what might work for me in our corner of the Frio River Canyon might not work for you, and even still might not work for me. What worked for me once might not work for me again. So please consider all of these factors as I present some of what I'm learning. So what to expect? I'll give a little bit of background on myself, make the case for gathering baseline knowledge, provide an overview on how I think about multi-factor management, provide a few pre-management considerations, and then go through some of the strategies that we are using and the lessons that I am learning. My background, you can tell I have a long history with Ashe Juniper, and that's all I'll say about that. I want to start by encouraging everyone involved with land management to learn as much as you can. Surround yourself with people smarter than you, which is not difficult for me. You can see here my friend Junie is teaching me a stern lesson or two. Not actually, but I have learned so much from others. So find every subject matter expert that you can and invite them to help you. That's what we have done here at the H.E. Butt Foundation. Collecting this baseline information allows you to better understand the multiple factors that impact your management. After all, you can't know how to manage your land if you don't know what's there. For example, do a vegetation survey and you might discover you have a rare species of cactus like the toebush fishhook cactus. Knowing you have this cactus may mean you don't want to let colonizing Ashe juniper establish where toebush may be. Do a bird survey and you might realize you have a juniper obligate species like the golden cheek warbler. Have as many subject matter experts out from as many disciplines as possible, and they may discover new species, extend the known ranges of species, or identify species of conservation need or rare and unusual things. For example, a new species of earthworm was discovered and described at the Foundation property based on the findings of a subject matter expert. The species epithet is HEBI in honor of the Foundation, and these are just a few examples of the many useful things you may learn along the way. So what are your goals for management? How do they need to account for the multitude of important factors to consider for wise management? Once you have your baseline information, you can integrate this into your management decisions by weighing all of the factors. Here are some examples of factors that come to my mind for a given plot of juniper. Is it bird breeding season? Is it too darn hot to go outside and work? Are there rules and laws that dictate the parameters of your management? Is your management allowing water to infiltrate and percolate and recharge groundwater? What's the grade of the area you are working? Are you slowing overland water to help mitigate flooding? Would removing cedar create erosion? Should it be left in place? Or can the slash be used as a nature-based solution to mitigate erosion? What can you afford to do? Maybe you can afford to do it, but do you have the manpower, tools, and dedication to maintain it? Are you replacing a monoculture species with a monoculture management, or are you creating necessary balance and resiliencies for a dynamic system? Is your management benefiting a multitude of species and goals? Do you need to create privacy between you and your neighbor? Would removing cedar remove a windbreak that you might miss once it's gone? Do you need to create a tidy and intentional look, or can you lop a branch and leave it? Do you need to clear a fire break to help mitigate wildfire risk? Or is your property insurance company asking for a wildfire mitigation strategies that aren't congruent with your other management goals? I won't provide examples for most of these, but like existing conditions and aspect, these seem significant or interesting food for thought, so I wanted to call them out specifically. Now that's a lot to unpack, but this is how interconnected our natural world is and how integrated and attuned to it that we need to be. So a consideration is your starting conditions. What are they? What is your end goal? This is a major consideration in what you do as you ask yourself if management in 50 or 100 years will have improved conditions over what is currently there. Previous degradation may limit what is possible. Manage your expectations for the outcomes based on the starting point. For example, what are you left to do with land that looks like this? Is clearing cedar going to maintain anything, or would you benefit from the needles dropping over time and the ground shading you receive from the canopy? Would grass grow here if all the cedar was removed? Is leaving the cedar or removing it going to benefit the watershed more? These are the types of questions I would encourage you to ask yourself. Do you have the budget, skill set, tools, equipment, and personnel to maintain whatever management you take on? If you clear cedar once, you'll probably have to do it again. So know that you are responsible for maintaining whatever your appropriate management is once that's been initiated. And don't bite off more than you can chew. Sometimes the wiser thing is to do nothing at all. Another considerations aspect, and this is a factor that I'm just currently contemplating, so I wanted to throw it out there. What role should the physical orientation of the land play in your management? The slope on the right side of the picture is facing north, while the slope on the left side is facing south. There is obviously a better vegetation response on the north-facing slope, so how can aspect inform your management? If you did need to clear cedar from an area like this, should you perhaps leave canopy cover on the south and west-facing slopes to buffer against hotter and drier conditions, since the response may not be as good? It probably depends on your goals. And then once you have all these factors figured out, sometimes you still need to balance that with the mission or values of the place you work, represent, or own. Perhaps then you can begin to arrive at appropriate management. Now let's look at some of the specific strategies that we've used and the factors that we've considered. This first strategy I'll talk about is what I'll call low slash on flat. The strategy here was to cover as much of the ground surface with slash as possible. So we limbed up the juniper slightly to allow sunlight and penetrate the understory. My hope was that this strategy, that the slash would provide more shade to help buffer soil temperature and retain extra soil moisture. I also hope that this will create a difficult terrain for ungulates to move through to minimize browsing and encourage hardwood regeneration, although there is evidence of some browse pressure within this type of slash. We are trying to create more diversity while reversing a trend towards juniper monoculture. Since this was mostly bare soil, I'm hoping to establish ground cover, buffer soil raindrop impact, and protect existing soil while building organic matter, all with the goal of encouraging more water infiltration into the ground. This is a different area where we use the same strategy. This location had a more degraded starting point than the previous example, so it hasn't had the same understory response so far. Keep in mind also that the drought could be suppressing potential response. I think the value of this strategy is providing the ground texture to slow overland runoff during heavy rain events. In more average rainfalls under an inch, the canopy and slash may be intercepting much or all of the rainfall, but once you get a heavy rain, this strategy may help minimize erosion. Some other trade-offs to consider with this strategy are that you won't likely run a prescribed burn through here, and you should also weigh the wildfire risk. With this strategy, you're leaving fuel on the ground, but also limbing up, which reduces ladder fuels. Depending on the wildfire, neither may matter much. You may also need to decide if this is creating enough diversity to meet your goals, or if something like cedar cages would be a better use of the slash. This is a strategy. This next strategy is the same low slash, but on a slightly steeper grade, as opposed to completely flat ground. This is an instance in which a southwest-facing hillside had natural juniper mortality, so the slash was cut low and used to cover as much surface area as possible to minimize erosion and encourage hardwood regeneration. There has been some understory response, but perhaps not as much as expected, and there is evidence that this slash does capture the soil and mitigate erosion. We've also used windrows on contour in which we use slash that's can be generated when less slash can be generated, and especially where there's some grade. We've created berms or windrows on the contour. This is a rocky northwest-facing hillside where there's little ground cover naturally. So my thought with this strategy was to minimize or slow sheet erosion, catch the soil and organic matter that is eroding, and hopefully establish ground cover that helps solidify these berms and expands up and down the hillside. These windrows seem to capture eroded soil relatively well. They have some understory species growing in them like mountain laurel, persimmon, and agarita, but don't have much evidence of hardwood regeneration yet. This strategy does seem to work well where there's some deciduous hardwoods mixed in, since the windrows capture leaf litter and create organic matter. This is also a bit more of a tidy strategy, which shows intentionality if aesthetics may be one of your factors. And to me, this seems like less of a wildfire risk than the low slash. It may provide better wildlife habitat, and this strategy hopefully slows overland flow and provides more opportunity for infiltration. We've also used these windrows on flat ground or on mild grade where there is some possible overland drainage. And this has been used especially when there's not enough slash to cover the surface area like the low and the flat, and where there are very few hardwood tree sprouts that can be protected with cedar cages. And these can be quite aesthetically pleasing, especially with supplemental seating. And I recognize that there may be a better use of slash than this, but I still think that this is a better strategy than piling and burning it. Another strategy that's been used in the past is mulching, and slash was mulched and spread on the ground, which could be a good strategy in theory, but in this instance, the mulch was too large and coarse and was layered on too deep. So very little, if any, water was reaching the soil underneath, and most of it seemed to probably be absorbed and evaporated by the mulch. So nothing was growing, and it was essentially a just bare area. And so we went through and we actually we scraped the mulch and used it to create these windrows that you see, and then we're able to get a vegetation response. But it was impactful to have to go back through and redo that management strategy that somebody in the past had thought would work well. Now, getting into some lessons, if you have a monoculture of juniper, collect local acorns and spread them into your slash, windrows, or cedar cages. I've collected bucketfuls of acorns and scattered them into areas where I'd like to see a more diverse forest composition. And I would advise you to seek not to only create species diversity, but also age class diversity to bolster resiliency. When we do cut cedar, historically we've gone through this progression of learning where we have pushed brush with machines, we've burned the slash, we've cut now, and then we've transitioned to cutting and mulching, and then now when we do cedar management, we do thinning and leave the understory species and reuse the slash. So I just wanted to provide this example of a layer of soil that's being held into place by juniper roots, and just show how much soil you could imagine would be lost from this root system if the cedar was ripped out of the ground with bulldozing. So this evolution of strategies that I've seen us do in the past is attempting to tread lighter on the land to maintain soil and install features that will hopefully build and retain organic matter in soil. Another lesson is that cedar crews may want to try to make cedar posts while they work, but this could result in cuts that aren't compatible with aesthetics or habitat goals, so that's something to be aware of. We've previously done a bit of cedar thinning around oak trees selectively to give them more room to grow. However, I'm starting to also see the value in the relationship between cedar and other trees that have seen instances where oaks lose branches or snap stems because they've lost their windbreak and support system where the junipers were removed. So these intercanopy relationships seem like they can be significant, especially in these tough cycles of deep freezing, ongoing drought, and sudden heavy rains. These canopy relationships may be more beneficial than we realize. This is 4 different types of bird nests that are all utilizing parts of cedar, so perhaps it's best to refrain from any tree clearing or thinning during the bird breeding season, regardless if you have golden cheek warbler habitat or not. And then lastly, this is natural juniper mortality occurring on a hilltop. Fortunately, there is ground cover, so perhaps this area is wanting to be a grassland. What is the system telling us in this instance and in every situation? If even a plant as prolific and hardy as cedar is struggling, then have some grace for the land and for yourself and your own management. Conditions can be really tough out there, and this isn't easy, but always try to learn and have grace. So I would encourage everyone to invest time and effort into developing baseline knowledge of the land you are responsible for. This will help you determine the suite of factors impacting your management decisions that should be considered before management begins. Package this baseline knowledge and these management factors into appropriate management tools and timing, and as you do so, learn from the process and from others. Maybe even try some new things and listen to what the land, wildlife, and water tell you in response. Thank you.
All right, I think there's time for at least one question. Anybody? Question? Anyone? Going once? Here we go. Okay.
I don't have a question, just a statement. I appreciate you saying what didn't go right.
Yeah.
So Asa, you may have said it, but how large is the property that you manage?
The property is 1,900 acres.
And do you manage it all kind of similarly, or is it different pockets?
These are snapshots. It's quite diverse in the types of habitat we have. So this was a focus on areas where we've manipulated cedar and specifically bringing that learning to this group, but it's got a lot of different habitat types.
Are there areas where you have passive management as well, just because
Absolutely.
of the size?
Yeah, the hillsides with mature juniper, oak woodlands are relatively passive.
What does HEB do on this property? Is it some kind of a retreat for the employees? I know they've got several places around the state.
So this is the H.E. Butt Foundation's property for, it's a retreat and camp center in Rial County.
All right, I guess maybe one more question, then I'll let.
Kevin, I'm curious to know how, you're doing a lot of implementation, management practices. How are you achieving that? Is it through with volunteers or contracting?
It's contracting. Yes, sir.
All right, I think we got to wrap it up there, so
Thank
you
y'all.
very much.